How did the supposedly outnumbered Arab nations end up with a crushing defeat against the newly born State of Israel? Greetings everyone, today, we're unraveling the complex and dramatic history of the Middle East wars. These conflicts, sparked by the creation of Israel amidst Arab nations, not only shaped the geopolitical landscape, but also had far-reaching global impacts due to the region's oil wealth and strategic location. We'll explore the origins of these wars, the surprising outcomes, and how they've shaped the ongoing tensions in the Middle East. If you find this video interesting, please support us by hitting the like button. Now, let's get started. The Middle East War began with a conflict between two groups over a region in the Middle East called Palestine. The two groups were the Jews and the Arabs. The Jews, who had lived scattered around the world for a long time without a country of their own, had been historically persecuted in numerous ways, and from the end of the 19th century, they began to seek a safe homeland to live in. Therefore, Jews claimed that they had the right to live in Palestine on the basis that a Jewish state existed in Palestine in ancient times, and immigrated to Palestine one after another from all over the world. However, in such Palestine, as in other Middle East regions, Arabs have already been living for nearly 1,000 years, and clashes began to occur in Palestine between Arabs who wanted to protect their homeland and Jews who wanted a homeland. In response, the United Nations, created for the purpose of maintaining world peace, proposed dividing Palestine into Arab and Jewish areas, rather than having one or the other, in an attempt to resolve the problem. But instead of peace, the partition plan led to a major war involving the entire Middle East world. In 1948, when the Jewish people proclaimed the establishment of Israel as their longed-for homeland, based on the partition plan by the United Nations, the Arabs did not accept it and decided to expel the Jewish people from Palestine by force. The day after the proclamation of the establishment of the State of Israel, the Arab nations existing around Palestine unite and begin attacking Israel. This marked the beginning of the First Arab-Israeli War. At first, the Arab nations overwhelmed Israel with their superior numbers of soldiers. But Israel quickly rebuilt its military and turned the tide of the war by collecting and reusing large numbers of discarded tanks from around the world. In the end, the war ended with Israel holding the upper hand, and a ceasefire was called about a year after the war began. As it was, Israel secured a larger area of land than the partition plan proposed by the United Nations, and gained independence as a nation. On the other hand, many Arabs who originally lived in Palestine fled to neighboring Arab countries to escape the war, and began their lives as Palestinian refugees. The Arab countries involved in the Middle East wars, faced with the poor quality of organization and equipment of their armies in the wars, began to think this way: before confronting Israel, we must first strengthen our own nations. In Egypt in particular, where an increasing number of people were questioning the ways of the king at the time, there was a growing demand for national reform. And eventually one man took the initiative and succeeded in removing the king from his position as leader. This man was Nasser, who later became one of the key figures in the Middle East wars. Nasser eventually took the helm of the country himself and proceeded to reform Egypt. But it was Nasser's actions during this reform that triggered the Second Middle East War. At this time, Egypt, led by Nasser, was promoting domestic reforms from a position of neutrality, taking no sides. As part of this reform, Nasser planned to build the world's largest dam in Egypt. But the construction cost was so enormous that he decided to rely on aid from the United States and Great Britain to pay for it. However, since Egypt was also involved with countries on the Soviet side that were hostile to the US and the UK did not take kindly to this, and cancelled their plan to provide financial assistance to Egypt. Nasser, who was forced to secure funds on his own, turned his attention to a project that was already generating enormous profits in the country: the operation of a gigantic man-made river. The river, called the Suez Canal, was designed to allow ships to pass from the sea to the sea on the other side of the land, and its existence greatly reduced travel time between Europe and Asia by ship. By taking tolls from ships around the world, The Suez Canal continued to generate enormous profits throughout the year. However, although the Suez Canal actually existed in Egypt, Egypt was not able to benefit from it, because the ownership of its operating companies was held by the British and French at the time. Nasser decided that Egypt could directly manage the Suez Canal and use the profits from the Suez Canal to pay for the construction of the dam. In 1956, Nasser declared the Suez Canal to be Egyptian property. Since Nasser was only declaring the legal ownership of a domestic company, it was obvious that any attack on Egypt would be met with a massive bashing from the international community. So Britain and France decided to use a certain country to create an excuse to send troops to Egypt. Israel. The plan was to have Israel and Egypt, which had been enemies since the First Middle East War, fight each other and intervene in Egypt as an intermediary. Israel took advantage of this strategy and launched an attack on Egypt. Just 3 months after the declaration that the Suez Canal was to become Egyptian property, thus began the Second Middle East War. As per the strategy, Britain and France immediately dispatched troops to the area around the Suez Canal, in the name of protecting public order. But the war was quickly brought to a conclusion when those two superpowers moved in at this time. Yes, the US and the Soviet Union. The United States and the Soviet Union, which were in violent conflict at the time, came together to voice their opposition to the war, forcing the United Kingdom, France, and Israel to withdraw from Egypt. Although Egypt was severely defeated in the battle, the US and the Soviet Union's efforts resulted in a major political victory, as Egypt achieved its goal of controlling the Suez Canal. As a result of the Second Middle East War, Nasser became a hero in the Arab world by driving back the great powers of Britain and France, who had once controlled the world. However, instead of unifying, the Arab world experienced growing internal divisions, largely due to the ambitions of several nations to dominate the region. In 1966, when a government supporting the idea of Palestinian refugees was formed in Syria, one of the countries bordering Israel, the Soviet Union, which had been steadily advancing into the Arab world for some time, made its move. The Soviet Union, already supporting Syria and Egypt, falsely claimed, Israeli troops are amassing in Syria, preparing for an attack. However, this was complete nonsense. The Soviet Union aimed to boost its influence in the Arab world by highlighting a common enemy, thereby fostering closer ties between Arab nations and itself. Egypt responded cautiously at first, but when its weak stance was criticized by neighboring Arab countries, it gradually began to show aggressive behavior toward Israel. In 1967, Egypt escalated tensions significantly by amassing its military forces near the Israeli border and imposing a blockade on a vital maritime route for Israel, rallying Arab nations and setting the stage for a major conflict. Perceiving these actions as a declaration of war, Israel initiated a preemptive strike against Egypt and other Arab nations. This included a surprise air attack on their military bases, effectively crippling the Arab air forces. Israel then launched an onslaught on land as well, bringing almost all of the Palestinian territories and parts of Egypt and Syria under its control within 6 days of the start of the offensive, and the Arab world suffered its most complete defeat to date. This is what is known as the Third Middle East War. Israel, having overwhelmed the Arab side in 3 Middle East wars, thought that it would not be able to put up any more of a fight. But the Arab countries reacted in the exact opposite way in 1973. Egypt and Syria simultaneously launched surprise attacks on Israel. Starting the Fourth Middle East War, this marked the onset of the Fourth Arab-Israeli War. Egypt succeeded brilliantly in this raid, and immediately stopped the attack as planned. From Egypt's point of view, it would have been ideal to hold talks with Israel at this point. But Israel took the cessation of the Egyptian onslaught as an opportunity to launch a concentrated attack on Syria. Syria, with the support of neighboring Arab countries, responded to this, but was unable to stand up to Israel's overwhelming military power. Egypt, at Syria's request, resumed its attack on Israel, but it was met with a counterattack by Israeli forces that had regrouped. The war in the Middle East ended in a ceasefire, again with Israel holding the upper hand. Despite these repeated wars, the confrontation between the Arab world and Israel remained on a parallel track. But this confrontation took a sharp turn 4 years after the Fourth Middle East War was halted. The Egyptian president visited Israel and delivered a speech advocating for peace. "Let us work hand in hand, in trust and in good faith, to break down this barrier." Why in the world would the Egyptian president, who had rejected Israel to that extent, take such an action? In fact, the Egyptian president, who had lost his country's territory in the course of 4 wars, and who could clearly feel the fatigue of his people, accepted the reality that there was an overwhelming gap in strength between his country and Israel. He had come to believe that the damage would only increase if he continued to engage Israel in a head-on collision. In the midst of this situation, the Egyptian president even heard that Israel now has nuclear weapons in its hands, and made a major policy shift to seek the return of territory without resorting to war any further. After years of hostility towards Israel, the Arab world, led by Egypt at the forefront of this antagonism, began to pivot towards seeking peace and acknowledging Israel's existence. With Egypt having made such a step forward and the world paying close attention to its developments, it was impossible for the Israeli side not to show a friendly attitude as well. Thus, in 1978, Egypt and Israel finally set up a meeting to discuss a complete rapprochement through the mediation of the United States. As a result of the talks, it was agreed that Egypt would recognize the existence of the State of Israel and return the territory that Israel had taken from Egypt in the Third Middle East War. However, this reconciliation between Israel and Egypt was unacceptable to other Arabs. This was seen as a unilateral move by Egypt, prioritizing its interests over the broader Arab cause, particularly the Palestinian issue. Thus, Egypt, which was regarded as a traitor, became isolated in the Arab world, and the Palestinian refugees and Arab countries continued to confront Israel without Egypt. Today, in addition to Egypt, more Arab countries are making peace with Israel. But Palestinian land has not been fully returned, and the conflict between the Arab world and Israel is still an unresolved international issue. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insightful content. Take care and see you in the next video. Goodbye.